Dr. Peter Wilson, is Emeritus Reader at Quaternary Environmental Change, School of Geography and Environmental Sciences, Ulster University in Coleraine. Peter continues to research the landforms and landscapes of mountain and coastal areas in Ireland, Britain and Norway, despite having retired from his university position in 2016. He is particularly interested in landscape changes brought about by glaciation and Earth's surface processes that have operated since the ice departed. Tonight, his talk looks at how the coastline at Portrush has changed over several thousand years, and how the sand dunes have been used by people living in the area. In the recent past, archaeologists have been able to excavate sites that have been exposed and in danger of being lost. So yes, there was life before golf, but not as we know it. Dr. Peter Wilson, please. Thank you.
Yes. Hello. Good evening. I want to start by confessing something. I don't play golf. I never have done. It's unlikely I ever will do. But before you ask me to leave, I would like to say that I think golf courses that have been constructed on sand dunes are potentially extremely interesting places. And that's what I want to try and explain to you this evening. So, life and death before golf. I know some people would say there was no life before golf. Golf is life. But I want to show you that people did live in this area, they did work in this area, and their remains can sometimes be found within this area. So I want to take you back to start with, to about 10,000 years ago. This is a computer-generated image of the coastline as it would have looked probably about 10,000 years ago. At that time, sea level was considerably lower than it is today. So the coastline was out here, to the north of the Skerries. The area between the Skerries and what is now the East Strand and the dunes where the golf course is, was dry land, except for this large pond or pool that extended in here. And it was dry land to the west of Portrush, out towards Port Stewart. And this dry land over here extended some considerable distance out from the present-day coastline. So the coastline was very different 10,000 years ago. This is what it looks like today. You're all familiar with this. If you stand in the sand dunes at Portrush and look across to the Skerries, you'll see this stretch of water. It's approximately 15 meters at its deepest. Let's quickly go back, wrong button. About 15 meters deepest here, gets slightly deeper over here. If we look at this area on Google Earth, we can see what it looks like quite clearly. Again, we've got the Skerries roadstead across here, the islands, the headland, the present-day beach, and the dunes with the golf course in it. Now, the first settlers in this area were the Mesolithic people, or the Mesolithic culture, which spans the period 10,000 years ago to about 6,000 years ago. And we all know about the site at Mount Sandal, on the outskirts of Coleraine, which was excavated quite a long time ago now, and we know people lived there, around about 9,000 to 8,500 years ago. Okay? These people undoubtedly moved along the coastline. And this diagram shows you a 10-kilometer radius from Mount Sandal. And 10 kilometers from Mount Sandal would take in the north coast. And these people undoubtedly went along that coastline because they used flint. And at Mount Sandal, and at many other sites of Mesolithic occupation, one of the main finds has been flint pieces, flint tools, flint weapons. So these people were undoubtedly familiar with the white rocks. Of course, 10,000 years ago or 9,000 years ago, the sea wouldn't have been there. But I'm not Moses. I can't get the sea to go back, I'm afraid. So this is what white rocks looks like today. And if you go to the rocks, you'll see within those cliffs, there are numerous nodules of flint. So the people moved along the coastline utilizing this material. It was a very precious commodity. They may have picked flint up as well from boulders that had fallen from the cliffs or been broken off from the cliffs by frost or by the glaciers that once passed along the coast. But they undoubtedly used large amounts of it to make their tools and their weapons. On the west strand at Portrush, you'll be familiar with the bed of peat that sometimes appears, usually in the winter months, when the sand gets stripped from the beach. Over 100 years ago, within this peat, which comprises a whole series of different species of vegetation, including large lumps of wood, so it was a forested or wooded environment. Over 100 years ago, in this peat, a large number of flint pieces were found. They weren't on top of the peat, they weren't below the peat, they were within the peat. This peat started forming about 8,000 years ago. And it stopped forming about 6,000 years ago. So if these pieces of flint were in the peat, they must have got in within that time span, 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. And the only way they could have got into the peat, because of the way they were distributed, is they were placed there or dropped there by somebody passing through this wooded environment. So that's why I say the people at Mount Sandal and their descendants undoubtedly passed along the coastline, obtaining flint. And one of them, fortunately, left it behind. And this was found, as I said, over 100 years ago, and details of the pieces were published in an article in 1934. So we've known about early settlers along the coastline for well over 100 years. Sea level was much lower 10,000 years ago, so people were able to move along the coastline, move along the area that is now submerged. But by about 6,000 years ago, the sea level had risen, so the coastline looked very different to what it does today. And again, this is a computer-generated image. It looks a bit odd because the coastline is a bit square and regular, but don't worry about that. About 6,000 years ago, when sea level was probably 3 to 4 meters higher than it is today, that is approximately what Portrush would have looked like. The Ramore headland would have been above the water, but where the golf course is, where the dunes are, would have been flooded. The dunes weren't there. They hadn't formed at that time. And where the bed of peat is, on the west strand, this area was also flooded. So from the west to the east, we had continuous open water. That's about 6,000 years ago. After 6,000 years, because the Earth's surface was rising slowly, sea started to fall away. So all this area here and here started to emerge from the sea. And people were able to revisit these areas as the land dried out, effectively. So, 6,000 years ago, if we'd been able to fly over Portrush, we wouldn't have seen this. It would have all been below the waves. This area would have been below the waves as well. So if you live in the low part of Portrush, your house is actually built on the seabed, because that's what it was 6,000 years ago. the bed of the ocean, the bed of the Atlantic. So there have been significant changes between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago in terms of sea level rise. And from 6,000 years ago to the present day, we've had sea level fall. So again, we've had remarkable changes. And it's after 6,000 years, as sea level was falling away, that the dunes, which are now occupied by the golf course, started to develop. Now, if you've ever walked on Portrush Beach or Portrush Strand, doesn't matter which one, when the tide is out and the sand is dry and it's particularly windy, as it seems to be most of the time in this part of the world, you'll have noticed that the sand blows quite easily, quite freely. And if you walk along the beach in conditions like this, you'll have to empty your shoes before you go in your house because they'll be filled with sand. So it's quite easy to see how, in a windy environment, when you've got bare sand that is drying out, the wind can easily move it. And this is how the dunes started forming. Sea level was falling, the sand that was left behind was drying out, the wind was moving the sand towards the land. As I said, this is Port Stewart. There's the clubhouse of Port Stewart Golf Club up there. And if you've ever walked down the road here and onto the beach at Port Stewart, after a windy period, that road gets a veneer of sand across it. So it's easy to see that sand gets transported quite some distance away from the beach. So this is what was happening as sea level was falling at Portrush, around about 6,000, around about 5,000 years ago. If you go to other sand dune systems in other parts of Ireland, you will see quite clearly evidence for earlier settlement. This is not in Northern Ireland, it's in County Donegal, but it shows you that before this sand dune system developed, there was an agricultural field system. That's a dry stone wall running across there. That area was overwhelmed by sand, and then later still, the sand has been eroded, revealing the dry stone wall. So we know that people were living in this landscape before the dunes formed. They divided the land up into fields. They were probably tending animals. Another site in the west of Ireland shows that in some sand dune areas, in some coastal regions, people were collecting large amounts of shells, shellfish basically, from the intertidal zone, bringing them on shore and cooking them up and having a good feast. This is what archaeologists would call a shell midden, a dump, a refuse dump of the shells from which the interiors have been taken out and have been eaten. This shell midden is actually much more extensive than shown on my photograph. It runs along the face of these sand dunes for a few hundred meters. So it represents quite a length of time for people in that area to have fished, to have feasted, to have left their waste products behind. And another type of material that you find in sand dunes, perhaps more common than the ones I've just shown you, is this sort of stuff. 21st century archaeology, if there's such a thing. Now, okay, we know it's litter, and we probably send somebody out to clear it up. It might be the council, it might be some volunteer. But if that was to be covered by sand, a thick layer of sand, and in 1,000 years or 2,000 years, that sand was to blow away, and that was left behind, it would be considered archaeology. It would be considered very valuable information about people and what they were doing in the sand dunes in the 21st century. And if the labels on those containers were still readable, some people might say, this was a campfire made by Australians. Or it was a campfire and the people sitting around the campfire were alcoholics. But some of them were fitness fanatics, so they took Lucozade instead. So, this sort of stuff in sand dunes is quite common. what you think of it is really up to you, but it's not much different to what was going on in sand dunes thousands of years ago. But they didn't have plastic and they didn't have tin. Okay, so let's go back to Portrush. A couple of photographs, beautiful photographs that John McNally has let me use, looking over the dune system, looking over the golf course. And you can see the extent of the golf course, you can see the extent of the sand dunes. And you'll notice, because it's a golf course, there's no sand visible. Well, there's very, very little sand visible because it's a managed landscape. They don't want sand blowing about on the golf course. So the archaeology that is abundant is actually hidden. And that's one good thing about golf courses. They protect the archaeology until such time as maybe a small part of the golf course needs changing, needs remodeling, and then some of the archaeology is exposed. So in sites like this, it's always advisable, and it's probably the case, that there's an archaeologist on site when work is taking place, so that if anything is found that is suspicious, the archaeologist can assess it before the work continues. So another good thing about golf courses and golf clubs is that they employ archaeologists when they're remodeling the landscape. Now, if you want to know what's gone on in the past in a sand dune system, or in any part of the landscape for that matter, you can go to the Northern Ireland Sites and Monuments Record. This is open to anybody, it's online. You've got to have some details of the site, the area you're interested in, and you can put in the details and it will tell you what is known about the archaeology of that area. So this particular page refers to the townland of Ballycraig Lower, which extends into the sand dunes here at Portrush. And then if you probably can't read the top paragraph, but it says that there are 3 megalithic tombs, large stone tombs, located in this townland, which is in the sand dunes. It also says that one of these tombs was destroyed by the process of creating the golf course. But that was before they employed archaeologists. So we can forgive them. But there are still 2 megalithic tombs in this area of Ballycraig Lower, somewhere within the sand dunes. When these tombs were first described and written up and published in an article, as you can see there, 1918, there were 2 diagrams accompanying the report. And these were plans of the arrangement of these large stones as they appeared, sticking through the turf, sticking through the vegetation of the sand dunes. Now, to my mind, they don't look like megalithic tombs. But the people who looked at these decided that they were. And the reason they don't look like megalithic tombs, I think, is because some of the stone had been removed, perhaps by landowners, farmers, to build walls, to build barns, etc. So they are remnants of the original megalithic tombs in this particular townland extending into the sand dunes. Now, just last year, some work was done in the same townland, Ballycraig Lower, in the golf course, in that area there, where I put the white circle. And when they stripped away the topsoil for the work that they were doing, preparing the fairway or the green, I'm not quite sure what it was. See, I don't know much about golf. Fairways, green, these words don't mean much to me. They came across some large stones. And a couple of photographs that were supplied by the archaeologists show the arrangement of these stones. And to my mind, they don't look like a megalithic tomb. But I don't think the entire area where these stones were found was stripped away. So there's probably more to either side. But this series of stones form a line. There's 4 or 5 big boulders there. It seems to come around here. There are gaps, and then there's another big stone here. It's quite a large structure. It covers quite a large area. Just what it was, I don't know. And I don't think the archaeologists know, because the report that John gave me was non-committal. It just said large stones found below topsoil. So let's cover them up.
I didn't say that.
No, not you, John. The report that you gave me said that. But this is in the same area where the megalithic tombs were reported in the early years of the previous century. So if this isn't a megalithic tomb, it's some other structure that is of antiquity, that perhaps was missed by the earlier archaeologists, which says something to us. It says there is still archaeology to be found within the sand dunes. Coming a bit close to the present day, we have Coarstown, the Bronze Age village that was occupied about 3,500 to 3,000 years ago, just up the hill from Portrush. You'll hear more about Coarstown next month. The 2 talks next month are about Coarstown. I'll be very interested to know what they have to say. There are a couple of artists' impressions of Coarstown, the village, as it was. You can see where it was, some distance inland, up the hill. Nice views over the coast. These people were obviously farmers, field systems. A lot of bone was found. Another artist's impression shows you that they had cattle. They seem to have pigs. I think these might be ducks. Oh, it's a dead one. It's got its legs in there. I thought they were ducks. Yeah, I see it now. I see it.
Somebody thinks.
So, one of the, if I just go back to that picture of the village, what I find it difficult from the archaeological report, they were so close to the sea, but they don't seem to have used the resources of the sea. There were no fish bones, for example, found at Coarstown. Yet they're so close to the sea that these people must have been fishing. The answer to that is, well, the soil is acidic and the fish bones might have dissolved in the acidity of the soil, which is probably the case. But it seems inconceivable to me that a population in this area for about 500 years did not use the resources of the sea. So if they used the resources of the sea, they probably went down to the East Bay or to the West Bay and passed through the sand dunes. And in doing so, they undoubtedly would have left some materials of one type or another. On site at Coarstown, flint has been found. Now, this is the Bronze Age. They were using metal, but they were also still using stone or flint. And this flint, again, is likely to have come from the White Rocks area. So if you live in Coarstown and you want to go to the White Rocks, and there's no golf course in the way, you cut through the dunes. So the Coarstown people were undoubtedly moving through the dunes. What else they were doing, God only knows. Anyway, a lot of the archaeology in the sand dunes was collected and removed during the latter years of the 19th century. At that time, there were quite a number of people who were known as antiquarian collectors. And this is one of them. This is William James Knowles of Ballymena. And for a number of years, number of summers in the 1880s, he came to the sand dunes on the north coast, not just Portrush, but Port Ballantrae, White Park Bay, Port Stewart, Castle Rock. And he brought his wife with him, and he brought his children with him. And he set them to work each day for several weeks each year, digging in the sand dunes and scraping away the sand. And he collected thousands and thousands of flint artifacts. Unfortunately, in the 1880s, antiquarian collectors did not record like archaeologists would record today. So a lot of his materials, we don't quite know where they came from. We don't know the exact context in which they were found. But a lot of his materials ended up in the Ulster Museum. and I believe most of them are in storage boxes in the basement. Another antiquarian collector at this time was Canon John Granger from Brushane. Now, he was a man of the church, and yet he spent a great deal of his time in the sand dunes. He collected artifacts. And again, a lot of his material has ended up in museums, but it's not very well documented in terms of exactly where it came from within the dunes. So a lot of the archaeology has been discovered, material has been collected, and it's still there, but we don't always know the exact context and therefore the exact importance of it. Anyway, that was in the 19th century, just coming up to nearer to the present day. This is one of the little car parks at White Rocks. And in the 1970s, a number of small car parks were put in to accommodate visitors who wanted to drive down and go on the beach. And in one of these car parks, as they were excavating, they came across a site. This was published in an article written in 1977, and in this site they discovered a small kist. A kist is a small, well, usually a small stone-lined grave. So the kist is shown in plan there, and a section through the kist here. This is where one of the car parks is at White Rocks. In addition to the kist, they found large numbers of flint artifacts. When they radiocarbon dated some of the bones from the kist, the age came out to about 3,300 years ago. That is the Bronze Age. That is the same age as when Coarstown was occupied. Whether this burial was anything to do with Coarstown, though, is an open question. But we've got burial monuments, the megalithic tombs, which are probably 4,000 or 5,000 years old in the dunes. We've got a kist, one kist, at 3,300 years or so. There are probably, hidden in the dunes, yet to be discovered, a large number of other kists. So one of the main activities that was taking place through time in the Portrush sand dunes was burial. So you can think of the Portrush sand dunes as a large cemetery, a large graveyard, which gives the golfers something to think about. We can still find new archaeological sites nearby. This is at Ballyrea, just to the west of Portrush. There's a golf course here as well. But just on the cliff edge here, there's sand, and some years ago, some of the vegetation slumped down the cliff, and it revealed a section in the sand, and we found quite a number of flint artifacts. We don't know exactly what age these are, but we think they're around about 5,000 or 6,000 years old. So there are still sites that can be found in sandy areas along this coast that tell us something about peoples of the past. And then finally, to finish, you probably know this story, and if you don't know it, I recommend that you read Hugh McGrattan's book about Portrush, because he goes into it in much more detail than I'm going to do. But the third hole, it's now the third hole, John, fourth.
Yeah, you're right, third hole.
It's the third hole, is it?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, it was the fourth.
You're right.
Yeah. It's known as the War Hollow, and the story is that in 1103 AD, King Magnus of Norway, or Magnus Barefoot as he's sometimes known, came ashore with his men to do a bit of pillaging, and they were ambushed by the Irish, and Magnus was killed. And some people say he was buried in the sand dunes in this area. Other people say Magnus died and was buried at Downpatrick. It depends whether you believe Wikipedia or whether you believe Peter Wilson. But he was undoubtedly Norwegian, because there he is. I interviewed him just a few weeks ago. Not a very friendly chap, as you can see. But when I went to interview him, I wore my Norwegian ski hat. So he came on side, so to speak. So there has been something going on in the sand dunes at Portrush regarding Norwegians from about 1,000 years ago. If there was a battle, if some people were killed, we don't know what happened to them. It's possible that in this area, there are the remains of some Irish warriors and some Norwegian warriors. So those of you that play golf, next time you go to the third hole, before you tee off, just think of King Magnus. You might be walking on his bones. Thank you.
Brilliant. Fair enough.